Okay, so let's jump into, let me make sure that you guys can see the screen. I'm going to share the application screen. And hopefully you should see on the screen a slide that says at the top, Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education.
Yes, sir.
Okay, all right, so let me make a few comments to sort of finish off this topic on civil rights. So we left off talking about Brown versus the Board of Education. I'm not going to go back and review all those points again. Right at the end of the class period on Thursday, you may recall that I told you that I shared the data with you that showed very, very limited movement towards the court, complying with the court's order. Certainly 10 years after the Brown decision, 12 years, 15 years, down to the mid-1970s, we still saw majorities of African-American public elementary and secondary school students that were attending public elementary and secondary schools where the enrollment was majority African-American. Did you have a question, Adam?
Are we going to have discussion closed this week?
We will. Yeah. Okay. So I shared that data with you, and I told you that, the court's decision in Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg was motivated largely by the lack of compliance. That the states where you had this legalized segregation, or even in states that allowed local options, and really not just limited to those states, really in most parts of the country, you had very little movement towards racial integration. And so the court, I think, out of frustration in 1971 in the Swan case, handed down that decision that ordered busing and, quote, other awkward remedies that might be imposed by the court proctors of these school systems and of these states. Okay, and then we finished right at the end of the class period last time. We finished by I had just sort of alerted you to the court's decision in Milliken versus Bradley, and remember that's the case where the Supreme Court said that you can't force busing across district lines, right? And I think that's one of the reasons that that table just ends at 1976, because with the phenomenon of white flight that we talked about last time, and the court's decision in Milliken versus Bradley, the likelihood that you were going to get much more movement in the numbers towards full compliance with the court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education just didn't really seem to be plausible. Okay, as long as whites, for example, were predominantly out in the suburbs and sending their children to schools in one school district, and blacks and Latinos were primarily in the inner cities and sending their kids to another school district, if you can't force busing across district lines, and the opportunities there for more movement towards integration just don't really exist. Okay? All right, so one of the things that we didn't get to last time, though, that I think is very, very important is despite the frustrations of compliance with Brown versus the Board of Education, I think one of the most important impacts of the case, aside from the constitutional matter, I mean, that's obviously the most important thing, where the court says that the Constitution doesn't tolerate racial segregation, right? But it also it serves as sort of a catalyst, I think. Do you remember when we were talking about the first congressional civil rights agenda, the Reconstruction era? We talked about all that legislation that Congress had passed in the 1860s and the 1870s. And I told you that a couple of things happened to bring that civil rights agenda to an end. And one of the things that happened was the civil rights cases of 1883, right? Where the Supreme Court essentially, as I like to describe it, sort of put the nail in the coffin. It was already, the politics had already changed, so that there really wasn't any political will to continue with the civil rights agenda. But the court just sort of hammered the nail in the coffin with this decision in the civil rights cases. Because you'll recall in those cases, the Supreme Court said that Congress doesn't have the authority under the Constitution to pass these kinds of laws, particularly the Civil Rights Act of 1875, right? So if we're going to have these kinds of laws, the court said way back in 1883, then they're going to have to be passed by the states. Well, there wasn't the political will in most states, particularly in the South, of course, to pursue that kind of civil rights agenda. All right, so I think the decision in the civil rights cases of 1883 are incredibly important in terms of, putting that first civil rights agenda to bed, so to speak. Right? So, sorry, I'm mixing metaphors, but you understand what I'm saying, right? Right? In a similar way, but actually in the opposite direction, I think the decision of Brown versus the Board of Education serves as a catalyst to a second civil rights agenda. Because when the court handed down its decision in Brown in 1954 and the second hearing in 1955, I think that puts into motion in the political arena some important changes. One, for example, you'll remember I showed you the numbers of the large Republican majorities in the Reconstruction era. Well, here's what we see in the 1950s. This is at late 1950s and 1960s after the Brown decision. You see these huge, this time it's Democratic majorities, right? You see, 2/3, almost 3/4 majorities during this period. And of course, you had the Democratic president, first John F. Kennedy, but particularly Lyndon Johnson, where, together with these large Democratic majorities, where you saw some very important civil rights legislation that was passed. Okay, so my first point here, new point for you today, is that the court's decision in Brown versus the Board of Education, I think, sent a signal to Congress and other institutions of government that it now took a view of the Constitution that was more supportive of a civil rights agenda. Okay? And so beginning in the late 1950s and through the 1960s, you see that Congress does undertake this second civil rights agenda. And this is going to be this presentation is going to be quick, very much like the presentation that I gave you on the first civil rights agenda, where I just threw the legislation up there and sort of hit the highlights. You're not going to really have time, I don't think, to transcribe the information on the screen. So maybe just take down the title of the legislation and maybe, the major point. And if you want to, then you can go, Google it and learn more about it, as you might be interested. Okay? All right, so we're going to talk about several civil rights acts passed by Congress. The first is in 1957, the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which established a new agency of government called the Civil Rights Commission. Many of you have probably heard of the Civil Rights Commission. The Civil Rights Commission was given the responsibility for investigating claims of racial bias. In 1960, Congress follows up with a second Civil Rights Act, which was specifically intended to stop Southern states from denying voting rights of African Americans. And while the 1957 Civil Rights Act and the 1960 Civil Rights Act were very, very important symbolic achievements, they lacked any enforcement authority. What I mean by that is, for example, the Civil Rights Commission may have had the authority to investigate claims of racial bias, but the legislation really didn't provide any enforcement authority. In other words, the Civil Rights Commission didn't really have any authority to do anything about it when they found racial bias. Okay? So the 1957 Civil Rights Act, the 1960 Civil Rights Act, I think are very important symbolically, but there's really no teeth in them. Okay? That changes in a big way, though. In 1964, Congress passes the Civil Rights Act. This is one of the crowning achievements. I would suggest to you that not only is the 1964 Civil Rights Act, one of the crowning achievements of the civil rights movement of the middle part of the 20th century, I think it's one of the greatest legislative accomplishments in any legislative arena. And it's hard to, talk about the significance of acts of Congress. If you were going to make a list of the most significant acts of Congress, for this not to be high up on that list. Okay? So the 1964 Civil Rights Act was pretty sweeping. It did a number of things. I'm going to highlight a few things for you here. It prohibited discrimination not only by government institutions, but also by private citizens in 4 areas: voter registration, public accommodations. If you are jotting any of this down, you might want to put an asterisk by that second one, public accommodations, okay? Because we've talked about that before, and we're going to elaborate here just a little bit in a second, okay? Public schools and employment. And on that last one, the employment front, the legislation also established a new agency of government called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Many of you have probably heard of that, the EOC. And it was assigned the task of ending racial discrimination in employment practices. Okay? And by the way, pursuant to that, the following year, in 1965, Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson, signed an executive order which gave the EEOC the authority to begin implementing affirmative action goals with respect to federal contracting, federal employment practices. So this is really the beginnings of the, effort on the part of the federal government to promote greater racial equality in employment practices. It's the beginning of affirmative action, what people, call affirmative action. Even people don't have a really good sense of what affirmative action actually requires or what it's actually about. We'll leave that issue aside. Okay? This is really the beginning. But it's really on the second point here, public accommodations, with the limited time that we have, that I just want to touch on a few things, okay? Because you'll remember that this is the very issue, this is the very part that went before the Supreme Court in the civil rights cases of 1883. Remember, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 had done exactly the same thing. What do we mean by public accommodations? Oh, we mean enterprises that are owned by private individuals or private entities, but they're open to the public. So what kinds of things are we talking about? Anybody? Hotels, restaurants, transportation systems, etc. Right? So the Supreme Court had said in 1883 in the civil rights cases that Congress doesn't have the authority to punish private individuals for discriminating on the basis of race. What provision of the 10th Amendment was relevant there? This is important. You might want to know this for, the final exam. Again, it's subject to testing on the final exam. What did the Supreme Court say in 1883 was the relevant provision of the Constitution? Well, first of all, let me ask you this. Does anybody remember how Congress defended its power in the civil rights cases of 1883? On what basis in the Constitution did Congress enact that legislation, or did it believe that it had the authority to enact that legislation? No? The 14th Amendment, specifically the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, right? And Section 5 that says Congress will have the authority to enact appropriate legislation to implement this article, right? So the 14th Amendment, okay? But the Supreme Court said in the civil rights cases of 1883 that the 14th Amendment is not the governing provision of the Constitution, because the 14th Amendment doesn't say anything about private individuals. Section 5 only empowers Congress to make laws that would prevent the states from discriminating in their official acts. And that's why they said that if we're going to have laws that punish private individuals for discriminating on the basis of race, they're going to have to be passed by the states, right? Why? What is it in the Constitution specifically? The reserve powers. And where do we find that? Reserve powers of the states. Where do we find that doctrine? The 10th Amendment. Good. Okay? All right, so now fast forward. Here we are in 1964, and Congress is at it again. Congress passes another law that is designed to punish private individuals who operate public accommodations if they discriminate on the basis of race. Now, I wonder why Congress believes in 1964 that it has the authority to do so when the Supreme Court had said 80 years earlier, 80 years earlier, that Congress didn't have the authority under the Constitution. Well, there's at least a couple of possibilities. One possibility is that a formal amendment was added to the Constitution giving Congress the power to do that. Anybody want to tell us whether or not that happened? Was there an amendment added to the Constitution that would give Congress that power? No, there was no new amendment was added to the Constitution. Right? Another possibility is that Congress really just doesn't care about the Constitution. Maybe Congress is saying, well, we don't care what, or at least they don't care what the Supreme Court back in 1883 was saying about the Constitution. Okay? Well, whatever the Supreme Court may have said back in 1883, or whatever the Constitution may or may not allow, see, we're going to do it because we believe that this is in the best interest of the country. Now, you know, the way you would hear some critics talk, you know, people who are very critical of Congress and maybe a progressive agenda in Congress, you would think that's exactly what it is. I mean, the critics, even today, will argue that when Congress passes legislation like, say, the Affordable Care Act, it doesn't, you know, the Obamacare Act. This is an argument that the opponents of Obamacare made back in 2010, right? That's not in the Constitution. Congress doesn't have the authority to do that. So apparently Congress just doesn't care about the Constitution. Congress just disregards the Constitution when it wants to do something. So that's a possibility here in 1964. Maybe Congress is just, forget the Constitution. We're going to do what we want to do, what we think's right. Or maybe a third option is that Congress, the collective institution of Congress, despite what I told you earlier a few weeks ago about Congress, most of the time we ought not think about Congress in that way. Maybe the collective wisdom of Congress, its members in 1964 is that the Supreme Court back in 1883 got it wrong. That, in fact, they do have the authority under the Constitution to pass this legislation. The 1883 decision just missed it. And I think really that's the answer. So wouldn't you know, wouldn't it just be predictable? It didn't take very long to test this, because in the same year, in 1964, two cases come before the United States Supreme Court, both challenging the authority of Congress to pass a law that punishes private individuals who operate public accommodations for discriminating on the basis of race. One case came out of the state of Alabama. That was the Katzenbach versus McClung. The case involved a barbecue restaurant in Alabama. There you see Ollie's restaurant, right? Ollie McClung was the owner-operator, and they refused to serve African-American customers. Turned them away. We only serve whites here. And that was a violation of this 1964 Civil Rights Act. And so the McClung was charged under, for a violation of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and it ends up before the United States Supreme Court. The other case, Katzenbach, Heart of Atlanta Motel versus the United States, involved a motel in Atlanta, Georgia, that refused to rent rooms to African Americans, and it comes before the Supreme Court here in 1964. So this time, the Supreme Court says that, yes, Congress does have the power under the Constitution. But it's not in the 14th Amendment. Interestingly enough, it's not the 14th Amendment. Actually, the court seems to be saying on that point, our predecessor court back in 1883 was correct. The 14th Amendment doesn't empower Congress to punish private individuals who discriminate on the basis of race. However, Congress does have the power under Article 1, Section 8 to regulate commerce among the several states. So you know what? The barbecue that is served at Ollie's restaurant, or some portion of the menu items at McClung's restaurant, Ollie's restaurant, are shipped across state lines. That constitutes interstate commerce. People travel over the Georgia state line from out of state, come into Georgia to check into the Heart of Atlanta Motel. That's interstate commerce. And Congress has the power under the Constitution to regulate interstate commerce. And furthermore, under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, you remember that from earlier in the semester? The necessary and proper clause? Congress has the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, including the power to regulate interstate commerce. So the court is saying, if Congress has the power under the Constitution to regulate the flow of interstate commerce, and it does, then it also has the power to regulate the flow of that interstate commerce. If that means, if it's necessary and proper, to prohibit private individuals from discriminating on the basis of race in order for Congress to fulfill its power to regulate interstate commerce, then it has the power to do so. So it's actually on the basis of the Interstate Commerce Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, and it doesn't show here on the screen, but you should also be aware that the Necessary and Proper Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, is also part of the equation. Okay, so once the Supreme Court upholds the 1964 Civil Rights Act, then some might argue then that's when things began to change, okay? At least in some aspects, in the area of racial integration of our society. Let me also throw in here a couple of other acts of Congress that you need to be aware of. In 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act prohibited discriminatory practices by the states in voting. We didn't talk about it in here. I talk about this in some depth in my Government 2306 course, so if I happen to see you in Government 2306, you'll get a fuller discussion of this. But we're talking about things here like the white primary, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, literacy tests, and a whole host of other devices that states used, many states used, to effectively keep African Americans from exercising their right to vote. So despite the 15th Amendment, when was the 15th Amendment added to the Constitution? 1875, or excuse me, 1870, thank you, you were exactly right, 1870, okay? So here we are 95 years later, okay? And Congress is passing legislation to realize the promise of the 15th Amendment. It empowered the Department of Justice to exercise oversight over states that had a historical or contemporaneous pattern of discrimination, so that anytime a state wants to change its voting laws, presumably the Department of Justice had to pre-clear it. That part of the Civil Rights Act, the Department of Justice pre-clearance provision, that part of the Voting Rights Act was struck down by the Supreme Court in 2013, in a case called Shelby County versus Holder. So we had a run of, 50 years there, a half a century or so, where the Voting Rights Act was very, very important in terms of preventing states from discriminating on the basis of race in its election laws. But many observers now argue that with the court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder, it has really opened the door to states that want to pass new restrictive voting laws. And we've had no shortage of conversation about that in the last year in this country. If you've been paying attention, you know that after the 2020 election, just here in the over the last several months, any number of states have passed a large number of laws that the critics argue, supporters say that they're just trying to prevent voter fraud, right? But the critics say what they're really trying to do is suppress voter turnout. Unfortunately for the critics, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 doesn't seem to provide a remedy anymore because the Department of Justice can't perform that function. The only remedy now, of course, would be to go to court. If a person believed that his or her voting rights were being, being kept away from exercising their voting rights because of a restrictive state law, then they would have to go to court, with all the expense that entails, all the time and money that entails to fight that legal battle. So, for example, and again, I don't want to digress too much, after the 2013 decision, it probably wouldn't surprise you that many states, including Texas, began passing photo ID laws for voting, right? Which the critics argue are discriminatory. Again, the supporters argue that they're just trying to prevent voter fraud. Okay. One last one here I'm going to share with you to close out the 1960s. Okay? And we're not going to pursue the 1970s, the 1980s, or beyond. Okay? Because this is really the peak of the civil rights movement. Okay? In 1968, Congress passed a law that prohibited discrimination in housing practices, which critics had argued was a glaring oversight of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Remember, the 1964 Civil Rights Act dealt with 4 areas. All right? Go back and remind you of that real quick. All right? 4 areas: voter registration, public accommodations, public schools, and employment. Nothing in there about housing. Okay? So some of the civil rights activists said, after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, oh, great, wonderful, we're on our way, but we're not done yet because we still have the little matter of housing, discriminatory practices in housing. Now, I don't know if you all are aware of this. I mean, well, have any of you ever seen Alex, you've seen a movie, or you've seen a stage play, or you read the book, or what do you know about this? Okay. And which version did you see? Did you see the one with Sidney Poitier or the one with Sean Combs? Sidney Poitier? Okay, so from the 1960s. Okay. And has it been recent enough that you remember enough about it you can share with your classmates what this was about? Okay. The storyline is about an African-American family living in the projects in Chicago. They come into some money, an insurance. The patriarch of the family passes away. There's a life insurance policy that, they get the check. And the mother, the matriarch now of the family, decides that they're going to buy a house. Okay? And a good chunk of the story is about the kinds of obstacles that they face in their effort to purchase a house in a white neighborhood, which has deed restrictions and restrictive covenants and so on that prevent the sale of a home to African Americans. Okay? But, I'm finding over the years now, as I talk about this issue, that fewer and fewer of my students raise their hands when I ask them if they've seen A Raisin in the Sun or some, play, movie or play, or maybe read the book. And I don't know if it surprises you if you hadn't seen this or heard of it in some other context, that there was a period in our history, not that long ago, where there were many areas of the country, it wasn't just in the South, but there were many areas of the country where there were these deed restrictions in place, where you couldn't sell or rent property to Americans, okay? Congress addresses that in 1968. It says that, that's illegal, okay? So again, the 1968 Civil Rights Act is kind of the fifth wheel, so to speak, and add to those other four to sort of complete the package. Okay? All right, last thing we're going to talk about here, and then I will open the floor to your questions. Okay? So much stuff that we didn't cover in this topic on civil rights, like everything else that we've covered this semester. Okay? I think I told you when we started this topic on civil rights a week ago that, with my apologies, we weren't going to talk about women's issues. Yes. Question? Is there a question from someone online? Nate, did you have a question?
No, sir. I shuffled around a little bit, but no, sir.
Okay, I don't know what that was I heard then. Okay. All right. So, again, I told you that we were going to focus on the issue of race just because we have such a restriction on our time. Because in my view, that's really been the critical, not that these other areas aren't critical, but it's been sort of what I would describe as the gut issue. Okay. But even more than that, it's because that was the issue that motivated the ratification of the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Laws. There's no evidence that the framers of the 14th Amendment back in 1868 were particularly concerned about gender equity issues. There's no evidence that they were concerned about discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. In fact, it appears that their only concern was discrimination on the basis of race. So that's one very important reason why I choose to use our class time to talk about the issue of race, civil rights in the context of racial equality. But just to sort of broaden it up a little bit and give you some framework for understanding how the courts view discrimination differently depending on who is being discriminated against, I think these three categories are important for you to understand. Okay? So let's put it this way. If you have a law or a policy that discriminates on the basis of race or ethnicity, the court considers race and ethnicity to be suspect categories. They're highly suspicious of any laws that discriminate on the basis of race or ethnicity. You with me? Because of that high level of suspicion, the court applies what is called the strict scrutiny test. They're going to apply the strictest scrutiny of the Equal Protection Clause. And that means, as a practical matter, that means that the law or the policy is assumed to be unconstitutional, a violation of equal protection of the laws, in the absence of an overwhelming justification. If you have a law or a policy that discriminates on the basis of race or ethnicity, and it's challenged, goes before the courts are going to apply the strict scrutiny standard. And so there's going to be an assumption there that the government is going to have to demonstrate an overwhelming justification for this discrimination on the basis of race. And this is the very reason why most observers, either supporters or opponents of affirmative action programs in hiring practices and in university admissions, for example, believe that the days of affirmative action are numbered, because they say that affirmative action discriminates on the basis of race. It may be an effort on the part of government to cure an evil. It may be an effort on the part of government to fix a wrong, but they say it discriminates on the basis of race, and the Constitution, the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause to be precise, does not tolerate discrimination on the basis of race. So many observers believe that affirmative action is, at some point, the court's going to decide a case where the court says you can't take race into account in university admissions, for example. Okay? We're not talking about quotas here. Quotas, the Supreme Court struck down quotas a long, long time ago, way back in the 1970s. I find it interesting that many people today still insist, when talking about affirmative action, that we're talking about quotas. We're not talking about quotas. The court said way back in 1976 in a case called UC Davis versus Bakke that a university, in this case it was a medical school, could not have a quota system having a certain percentage of its entering class, to be African American, a certain percentage to be Latino, etc. Okay? What most universities do, whether we're talking about an undergraduate program or a graduate program, public universities that is use some sort of system, might be called various things, but like a race plus kind of system, where they might award in all the factors that they consider in admitting students to the class, to the entering class, where they might, provide a few preference points on the basis of race. Now that went before the Supreme Court in 2013 and 2016 in a case involving a young woman named Abigail Fisher, who lifelong dream was to get her college degree from the University of Texas. Abigail Fisher attended Clements High School in Sugar Land, Texas. And Abigail Fisher was white, and she was just outside of the top 10% of her graduating class. Do you know why that's important? Because Texas has a law that if a student graduates from high school in the top 10% of the class, they can go to any public university in Texas they want to, automatically. So she was good, but she wasn't good enough to get in automatically. And that meant, like so many other students who applied to the University of Texas, she was going to have to be scrutinized by the admissions officers. And they were going to have to, put some sort of ranking system of why they should select this student over that student. Well, the University of Texas, in its system, in its admissions process, awarded preference points for race, because they argued it was their effort to diversify their university community. But Abigail Fisher believed that she was denied admission. She didn't make the cut. She believed she was denied admission because she was white. And she argued that it was reverse discrimination. I don't feel too bad for Abigail Fisher, because she went to Louisiana State University and got her degree. I'm sure she's doing just fine. But the Supreme Court, in the initial case in 2013, remanded it back down to the district courts on a technical issue, but then heard the case again in 2015, and much to the surprise of a lot of observers, again, both supporters of affirmative action and opponents of affirmative action, who believed that the court would use this case to finally strike down affirmative action, the use of race in admissions, the Supreme Court surprised them and upheld the University of Texas's admissions practices, but on a very, very narrow standard. And so the question is still out there. And it may be in the near future, perhaps, or who knows how long it'll take, but some other case will come before the Supreme Court, and it'll take up the broader question about the use of race more directly. Okay? All right. If you have a law or a policy that discriminates on the basis of gender, the courts consider gender to be an almost suspect category. And so they apply what's called the intermediate scrutiny test, which means that the court assumes that the law or the policy is unconstitutional unless it serves a clearly compelling and justified purpose. And if the distinction between overwhelming justification on the one hand and clearly compelling and justified purpose on the other hand seems like a fine distinction to you, well, join the club. There are a lot of people who would say, okay, what's the difference? Right? Well, I don't know how to answer that to your satisfaction, except to say that we have to look to the history of the framing of the 14th Amendment, which I told you a few minutes ago. It's very clear that the framers of the 14th Amendment were motivated exclusively by their concern about discrimination on the basis of race and promoting racial equality. There's no evidence that they were concerned about gender equity issues. So while the 14th Amendment says no state shall deprive any person within its jurisdiction of the equal protection of the laws, and women certainly are persons, okay? The discrimination against women is really, really bad in the eyes of the law, but it just doesn't quite rise to the same level as discrimination on the basis of race, based on the Constitution, not based on morality. I'm not telling you that the court's saying it's more wrong morally to discriminate on the basis of race than on the basis of gender. We're talking about what the Constitution says here, right? Which, by the way, if you think about it, this is the exact reason that women's rights advocates want an equal rights amendment to the Constitution. Right? That's the motivation. Because the 14th Amendment, it helps, but it's not the full measure, they would say. Women need to be protected against discrimination with the full force of the Constitution, they would say. You know what I mean by the Equal Rights Amendment, right? If you've read chapter 5 in the textbook, you probably are familiar with it, right? Or maybe you knew about it before, right? The proposed amendment to the Constitution, which was actually proposed back in the early 1970s and got fairly close to ratification, but fell just a few states short of being ratified. So it was not added to the Constitution formally. But there's been a new push in the last couple of years, particularly in the wake of the Me Too movement, which began, in 2018 or 2019, whatever it was, to get that amendment ratified. Okay? So any questions about the distinction between strict scrutiny and intermediate scrutiny? Now, a number of years ago, students would ask me about sexual orientation. They would say, what about laws or policies that discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation? And I would say, well, the court sees that as a not suspect category and therefore applies something called the reasonable basis test, okay, which means that the law is assumed to be valid, assumed to be constitutional, unless no sound rationale for the law or the policy can be found. Okay? But that changed in a big way, okay? Most notably with the Supreme Court's decision in the Obergefell case in 2015, which, as you recall, that's the case where the Supreme Court said that state laws cannot prohibit same-sex couples from getting married. So I think sexual orientation is either moved or is moving into this category here, almost suspect category, with gender. That make sense? Okay? All right, and the last thing here, just to knock it off formally, if you have laws that discriminate or policies that discriminate on the basis of age, give me an example of a law that discriminates on the basis of age.
Voting?
Um, They do. I mean, certainly laws do discriminate on the basis of age. You know, we do have an amendment. We do have a provision in the Constitution that says that, you know, states can't, or that means that states can't prevent people from voting on the basis of age as long as they're at least 18 years old. You know, that was the late 1960s that was added to the Constitution, or early 1970s, I guess.
Employment in the armed forces?
On the basis of age? Okay, yeah, I mean, I'm not aware of any issues that have been raised, like maybe a 16-year-old wants to join the Army, but they're told that they can't because the policy is, you know, at least 18, and then they say, well, I have a right to join the Army, and then they go to...
The other end of the spectrum where you've got to be under a certain age.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure, yeah, right, I mean, it works either way, you're right. I was thinking about just on the young end. Yeah, I mean, I think the military probably wouldn't have too much of a challenge demonstrating that it has a logical reason to have those age restrictions, right? Well, I thought the one that most students jump right on is like the minimum drinking age, right? Can states have laws that tell people who are under the age of 21 that they can't drink alcohol? That discriminates on the basis of age. In fact, people who are 18, 19, 20 years old oftentimes are known to say things like, oh, I can pay taxes, or I can, you know, go into the military, or I can do this, or I can do that, but I can't drink, right? That's discriminating against me on the basis of my age. But the courts have upheld those minimum drinking age laws on the grounds that it's, you know, not a suspect category. Age is not a suspect category. I indicated income here. Believe it or not, there have been over the years people who have argued that the federal income tax discriminates on the basis of income. It applies a different tax rate based on the individual or the household's income. So wealthy people, for example, might take the view that you're punishing me because I'm wealthy by applying a higher marginal tax rate. But again, the courts have upheld that. Okay? So if the government can demonstrate that it has a logical reason for it, then because those are not protected categories, age and income are not protected categories. Okay? Questions about any of that? Okay, well, let's, you know, again, as I say, there's always lots more that we could talk about with this topic or any other topic, but we have to draw the line somewhere, and we're quickly running out of time. We only have about 15 minutes left in today's class meeting, so let me open the floor to you. Anybody want to ask questions about, maybe let's start with the material that we've most recently covered. Any questions about this topic on civil rights? Yeah, John?
I just had a quick question about the Shelby County versus Holder case.
Okay.
What is it that, like, what's the reasoning and cause for the case, like, you know, the court striking down the, you know, the voting rights?
That's a very good question. And I think that just wanting to know that, either for the purposes of testing or just wanting to know the answer is a great question. And, you know, I wish that I'd, you know, had more time that I could have taken that in great detail. But since you asked the question, I'm going to address it. And I'm going to try to do it as simply as possible. Basically, what the court said is when Congress passed that Voting Rights Act in 1965, there were states who were at the time, not only did they have this historical pattern of denying access to voting on the basis of race, but at that time, there were mechanisms in place to try to keep people from voting on the basis of race. Poll taxes, for example, okay? Literacy tests, grandfather, not grandfather, but you know, a variety of devices that were used in a number of states. So a state like Texas, for example, would have been one of those states that had a history of discrimination against African Americans or maybe even Latinos on the basis of race or ethnicity when it came to access to voting. So if the state of Texas wanted to change its voting laws, it would have to get them cleared by the Department of Justice. That was the motivation. In other words, what Congress was essentially saying in 1965 is, to kind of go back to something that I mentioned to you a few minutes ago, we can't wait for the system to change as a result of individuals dragging states to court because they believe that they've had their voting rights discriminated or voting rights taken away. All right? You understand what I'm saying? Like, Congress is providing a mechanism in 1965 to say, you don't have to go through the time and the expense and the aggravation or, making yourself the target of those who would want to do you harm because you've sued the state of Texas because you believe that the state of Texas is discriminating on the basis of race when it comes to voting. Instead, we're going to allow the Department of Justice to say, no, Texas, you can't have that law because it's discriminatory. Okay? But in 2013, and that, by the way, that case, that Shelby County case, came out of Alabama. There's also a Shelby County, Texas, but Alabama was also another state that would have fallen under that history of discrimination and contemporary discrimination and so on. So the court said in that case that, look, all of these past discriminations that states like Alabama might have used, or like Texas might have used, or other states, Mississippi, other states might have used to prevent African Americans from voting, that's in the past. Okay? We don't have that. Those don't exist anymore. White primaries don't exist anymore. Poll taxes don't exist anymore. These other devices don't exist anymore. So because the circumstances are different in 2013 than they were back in 1965 when Congress passed the act, there's no longer any justification for empowering the Department of Justice to pre-clear state laws. You see, under our Constitution, I didn't mention this point, but you actually ask a great question, okay? Under our Constitution, we don't have national elections. Even the election of the president is not a national election. Congressional elections are not national elections. Under our Constitution, the states run the elections, and the states pass their own election laws. That's why the election laws are different in Texas and Georgia and California and so on, right? But the restriction is, presumably, that the states can't pass laws that would discriminate on the basis of race, right? Or some other arbitrary basis. But since we're talking about the issue of race, right? That goes back to 1870. That's what the intent of the 15th Amendment was, to prevent the states from making laws that discriminated in voting on the basis of race. But we know what happened, for 100 years, but you finally get to 1965 and Congress says, we can't wait another 100 years, right, to extend full voting rights without regard to race. And so that's why they set this Department of Justice preclearance. But the court is saying in 2013 that that's in the past, so there's got to be some current justification for it. Congress is going to have to, if Congress wants the Department of Justice to exercise this authority, it's going to have to rewrite the law. It's going to have to update the law or something and provide some contemporary justification for meddling, having the Department of Justice meddle with the state's authority under the Constitution to write their own election laws. Does that help? Does that make sense? Maybe could have said that more eloquently, but I think that's the basic gist of the court's argument. What else? What other question? That was a good one to start us off. What else do you have? This is a really good opportunity for you guys to clear up things that you might be confused on before you sit down and take your final exam.
So it's not on civil rights, this question.
Okay, yeah, we can open it up more broadly. Go ahead.
Yeah, it was actually on the ratification for the Constitution. Just a little bit confused. Is it going to be proposed by 2/3? Whether it's
You're talking about the Constitution as it was originally written in 1787 or amendments?
Amendments now?
Okay.
So it's got to be. The way I'm seeing it, it can be proposed by Congress or a state with 2/3, but then it needs 3/4 from either Congress or the states to get ratified.
Okay, so think about the process of amending the Constitution as occurring in two stages, two distinct stages. The first stage is formal proposal. And the reason I think it's important to put that word formal in front of it is because we're not just talking about coming up with the idea for an amendment, right? And somebody put the president putting an idea out there for a constitutional amendment. What the Constitution requires is a very formal thing to happen, which is you have to have a vote in the House of Representatives and you have to have a vote in the United States Senate. And you're right, it requires extraordinary majorities, 2/3. 2/3 of the representatives, 2/3 of the senators to just propose the amendment.
And that can also be done in the states as well, as long as it's 2/3 of the states.
Well, there is a provision in the Constitution in this discussion of how to amend the Constitution, which would allow Congress to call a constitutional convention at the request of 2/3 of the states. But that's never been used. Okay? And most observers believe, thank goodness. Okay? Well, at least people who admire the Constitution, which I count myself among them, right? Most aspects of the Constitution. There are obviously some, parts of the Constitution that have been unfair to various groups, but the idea that you could have a constitutional convention is very discomforting to a lot of people who value the stability of our system, because they argue that who knows what might happen at a constitutional convention? Who knows what they might come up? They might come up with a completely new document. So that's never been happened. So as a practical matter, really what we're talking about in the proposal stage for 27 of the 27 amendments is 2/3 vote in the House of Representatives, 2/3 vote in the Senate just to formally propose it. Now, once it's proposed, then you go to the ratification stage. That's the second stage. And that can happen one of two ways. It can either be with special ratifying conventions that are set up by the states, or by the state legislatures, by the legislatures of the states. And 26 of the 27 amendments have been ratified by state legislatures. There's only been one that's been ratified by special ratifying conventions that are set up by the states. Okay, does that help?
Yeah, so that the first bullet up there, the process for amending the ratification, is that referring to now or is that referring to originally?
Oh no, it means now, what we just discussed. Okay. When you say originally, this part of the Constitution still operates as it originally operated. That hasn't changed. The process for formally amending the Constitution is the same in 2021, if we had the occasion to do that, as it would have been back in 1789 when the Bill of Rights were drafted. Remember, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, we've talked about this, were drafted by Congress, by that first Congress, right? Particularly James Madison as a member of the House of Representatives. But you had, on these 12 articles that were drafted, a 2/3 vote of the House of Representatives, a 2/3 vote of the Senate, and those 12 articles were sent to the states, and then 3/4 of the state legislatures ratified 10 of them, 10 of the 12. So that was the same from the very beginning as it is now. Good, what else? What I recommend that you do, we still have 3 or 4 minutes here, and I'm not saying if you have another question, I'm happy to field it, but while you're looking through your notes and thinking of something you want to ask, let me strongly encourage you, since we're going to take the entire class, well, we'll take the reading quiz at the first of the class meeting, but after that, it's all review of the final exam. So what I want to encourage you to do is, prepare for that by looking through your notes, and you're flipping through the textbook and finding things that take this document here and write on it, print it out and write on it, right? When I ask about this, or actually write out your question, so that you can get answers to them. Yes, sir.
The test is 50 questions, right?
It is. But I want to use our review sessions to field substantive questions. I don't want to field format questions. I think that oftentimes students get too wrapped up in the format of exams, and they very few questions about substance. I don't mind answering those kind of questions, but I don't want to be fielding nothing but format questions on Thursday, right? So, again, I'll tell you what, since we have a couple of minutes here, 50 multiple choice questions, right? You'll need to bring a Scantron form with you, the one that Joanna held up last time, right? You held up one for us last time, right?
Yes.
Yeah. That's okay. It's the one that has 50 on the front, 50 on the back, okay? And you'll need to bring a pencil, number 2 pencil.
So the purpose of the Virginia plan was to have the members of the House based on the representation based on the population of their state, right? Because they had the larger state, right?
I'm not sure I caught the first part of your question, but I think what you're asking me is the House of Representatives based on?
The Virginia plan, they wanted their representation of the House to be based on their population because they had the.
What are you pointing to? You're pointing, I can't tell what you're pointing to. Tell me what the Virginia plan.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yes, the Virginia plan, you're right. That's the part I wasn't getting. Okay, the Virginia plan was one of the plans that was introduced at the Constitutional Convention. It really became the template for the Constitution, but on the question of representation, what it proposed was representation based on the population of the states. So that's why it's sometimes called the large state plan. Because
New Jersey was opposite, right?
Yes, New Jersey. The New Jersey plan really just wanted to replicate what had existed under the Articles of Confederation. Remember, under the Articles of Confederation, each state had a vote, regardless of its population size. And so that's kind of essentially what the New Jersey plan was proposing. And then what about the Connecticut plan? What did it propose?
Combination of the two.
Yeah, that's the Great Compromise, as we call it, right? Where we get the House based on population and the Senate based on the principle of equal representation for the states. All right, got about 15 seconds. All right. If you have no other questions, we will see you on Thursday, but come on Thursday with the idea that we're going to get you really prepared for the final exam. All right? We'll see you on Thursday.